Hello everyone, welcome to my first YouTube tutorial. Back in March, I posted a short video of how I like to paint grass using gouache, and I got a lot of asks for a longer video with some more detail and explanation of the process. So here I'm going to be showing you my process for painting 3 different versions of grass as we're going to be recreating this page of my sketchbook. I often start out by pre-mixing the colors that I know I'm going to be using several times. If you're just starting out with painting, it might be nice to have several colors pre-mixed so that they're ready when you need them and you have the ability to go back later and touch up things or change them without the pressure of having to mix the exact same shade again. For this video, we're going to keep it really simple and beginner friendly, so we're just going to be using 3 different shades. The base color and then a highlight and a shadow. I have this green paint which I really love to use just straight out of the tube, which is the Schmincke Akademie Gouache sap green. It has this really nice and slightly olive color that I think often goes very well with both a more cottagecore vibe but also these more kind of Ghibli style colors that are a bit cooler. The color might vary depending on what brand you're using, but here you can really just choose whichever green that you enjoy. For the highlight color, we're going to be mixing our green with a larger amount of yellow to get these very nice and warm highlights. I'm also mixing in just a tiny bit of white, and this is not really to lighten the color, but for a lot of gouache paints, if you mix in just a tiny bit of white, it won't really change the color as much as it will just make the color pop a bit more and enhance the opacity, especially in reds and yellows, which tends to have a slightly lower opacity than the other colors. And then for the shadow, I'm mixing in a bit of Prussian blue to darken the green and give it a classic cooler shadow. I'm also mixing in just a tiny bit of black here, both to darken it a bit, but also to keep the saturation down. So here you're going to be starting off with either an angular brush or a flat brush. You can use both. Here I'm using an angular one, and we're just going to be painting very loosely in horizontal lines going down the page. I'm leaving some empty spaces out for shadow and highlight areas. Here I'm not thinking too much about the actual placement of the lines, and I'm sort of using the brush to give me some randomness, sometimes doing a bit of a zigzag down the page, and you can also see me doing some little upwards flicks throughout to soften out these edges and keep it a bit less flat. Afterwards, I'm filling out the holes I've left on one side with the darker color, and the other side I'm filling in the highlight. And this is not strictly one color of each side. For a bigger field, I would have some darker spots on the sort of highlight side and also the other way around. When filling out these 2 colors, I also make sure to sometimes flick up the brush, and this both smooths out the line between the colors, but with the flat brush as well, it also creates some very nice textures that will be giving a lot of life to the field once we've added the details. Once I've painted the base layer of our field, I'm going in with a smaller brush, and this can really range between a lot of different brushes. Here, I'm first using a small round brush, and then later I've switched to a detailing brush just to show you that you can use a lot of different brushes here. What we're doing is that for all of the places where 2 colors meet, we're going to be dragging up the bottom color. This is just with small simple flicks. They don't have to be thin or perfect, they just need to break up those very obvious horizontal lines, since those don't really tend to form naturally outside. And some of the places where we initially did that little upwards flick of the color, you can leave this out since the line has already been blurred a bit. And I'm just going through all of the places where colors meet. Sometimes you have to switch between the colors a couple of times where some of the lines are a little closer together. But try not to get too impatient at this step. It can take a while, but as you make more of these, you'll probably get more comfortable with that initial layer and how to do it a little quicker. So lastly comes the details. Here you can just use any sort of brush you're comfortable with for painting thinner lines for the individual grass straws. I used one of my Artify detailing brushes for this. So here I'm starting by going around and adding some individual strokes at the end of the different horizontal lines so that we don't have these sudden stops in our colors, making everything a bit more fluid. I'm also going to be adding some small clumps of grass around the field where there's more of a big spot of the same color. So for the darkest parts, we'll add in some of the base color. For the base color, we can add both shadows and highlights, and for the highlighted parts, we'll only add from the middle color. And when doing this, make sure that you vary up the distances between these and don't just paint them in the exact middle. The more they vary in size and distances, the more natural it will look. And then we're done. We're gonna go back to our angular or flat brush and start with our darkest color. I usually dip it in water before getting my paint on here to make it a bit thinned out and more fluid so that the paint will flow a bit on its own. And then with this, we're just going to be making the basic shape of how you want the grass to be. This again should just be made kind of quickly, and it really doesn't need to be very fleshed out here. We're then going to use our base color and go over the top of the clump. Sometimes I like to just dip my brush in water first and drag it on the top edge of the first layer so that the colors will blend more on their own. You can see me here going a bit back and forth, dragging some of the base color down and the darker color up with some small dots as well. And honestly, here I did overwork it a bit more than necessary. A lot of the look of this comes from the paints blending on their own and not being too overworked. With our flat brush, we can turn it to its side and make small little dots along the top so that we don't have a completely straight edge. And you really just have to trust the process here, since in the beginning it doesn't look quite as nice as it will eventually. And now I'm letting the back layer dry completely before moving on. And for the brush of the individual grass pieces, I'm gonna first show it to you using a round brush, and we're going to go from the back to the front. So first we're getting the base color, and then we're gonna start by putting in some of these finer grass straws. I'm starting them in the part of the paint that's the exact same color. This is where it's really nice to have them pre-mixed so that the bottom of the line will blend in seamlessly with the back. And generally I'm having these curve away from the bush, but of course also making some exceptions for it to look a bit more interesting. And here it's really important to have the right thickness of paint. If it's too thick, you'll probably get very splotchy lines and they won't be smooth and continuous. And if your paint is too thin, it might bleed or will dry with a transparency that we don't really want here. So I'd encourage you to just very slowly mix in water and test it along the way if you're unsure of which thickness is the best. It will vary a bit depending on your brand exactly how it should be, but my best advice is to find out the consistency for the brand of paint you're using, but it will probably be something along the line of very fluid honey. When I've done this across the back, I go and do the same thing to the darker area, starting the strokes in the dark and pulling them up into our base color. Mostly I won't draw them farther out than the green, but of course a couple of them can be, and here I'll also add a few strokes at the front, breaking up the harsh line of the bottom of the bush. I'm also again varying the number of lines I put together and how long they are, how curved and such. When I've done this, I go back to the base color again and add that on our dark layer. Here again, I won't draw them up further than the dark, since then they will just be lost in the same color background. I'm focusing on making some smaller groupings of grass straws, trying not to have them all be equally spaced, but varying in size, number, and distance. Also, keep in mind here that we'll add some highlights so you don't have to fill out the full space. You can also sort of see me doing a lot of the hand movement at the same place without anything happening. I tend to do a lot of flicks where I end up not actually touching the paper, and I'll just slowly lower my hand in between strokes until I hit the paper. And this is to make sure I don't accidentally press my brush down too far and then make a line that's way thicker than I want. For highlights, I'll add a couple at the front of the bush with the same logic as I've explained previously. We don't want them to be equally spaced, and we don't want them all to be of similar size and number. And then I also add some in the back. Here I'm adding fewer, and also will usually make these a bit shorter than what I've done previously. I also generally like to go back afterwards and add a couple of really short lines of all three color variations, just 2 or 3, to make the grass look even more lush. If you are a bit impatient or maybe haven't quite mastered these strokes with a bigger brush yet, you can of course use a detailing brush as well. I do think it's valuable to practice this with a bigger brush to develop your brush control, but that's not always what we're in the mood for when we're painting. So here I'm showing you the exact same process but with a detailing brush instead. And of course it's always completely up to you what type of brush you choose, but it's good to be aware of your different options. I also went ahead and included a bit of extra detailing in this one for some added interest, and some flowers in the first version to show some of the different options for using these. I won't really talk about their process in this video, but I've made a separate tutorial on a variety of different flower bushes in the same style. And at the end of the video, I'll also talk a bit about how to vary the grass in mood and color, and I'm going to be showing you a couple of different examples of this. And then for the third grass version of this video, which is a top-down look at a grass field, which you might just paint like this, or maybe you're wanting to include some flowers on top. For it, I've first mixed in some more black in our darkest color, and with this I'm just completely covering the background. I always tend to want a background even darker than what I've made in the beginning, so here I tried adding even more black than usual. Most of the time gouache will have a different color when dry, and this is something you'll slowly get used to with your type of paint, but I know that the green I use here dries much lighter, so I have to make it a lot darker than what I want. Then next I'm going in with our dark color from before. I'm using my round brush here since I want to be a little more loose with these layers, and it's often faster for me to use this one since I don't have to go back for paint as often as with a detailing brush. And I'm just slowly mapping out where I want the different grass directions to go. Since this is a top down, I'm going to have a couple of areas where the grass is sort of springing outwards from a center, and then in between these I'm defining a couple of directions where the grass might have laid down. And for this color I'm mostly focusing on the sort of outside of these areas, making space for lighter grass in their middles, since this is just the initial background layer of grass, so I'm defining where the grass will be overlapped by another group of grass pieces. And actually for this one I ended up having the background darker than I wanted compared to the darkest grass layer, but of course this all depends on the look you're going for. Then next I added some sap green to the darkest grass color to lighten it up a little bit, and then continued following these guidelines I just made for myself. This time going a bit closer towards the middle of my clumps, which further defines the separation of the different groupings. When I'd been through all of the sections, I moved over to my straight out of the tube sap green, and I repeat this process again. We're focusing closer in on the middles and just defining a bit further. You can also choose how you want the look of your grass to be. You can have all very smooth lines, or you can have a lot of more rigid lines, or a combination, completely up to you. Here, most of my lines are pretty smooth, and then I just add in a couple of oddballs to add some interest and make it look a little bit more realistic. And then lastly, I'm going in with a highlight layer, which I use a bit more sparingly, just putting in the final definition on these different separations I've made. And then usually I would have probably added flowers to this between the sap green and highlight layer, but here I just wanted to show you a bit of the process of how this can be made before adding your details. And in the end, you just see me add a couple of white dots to add a little bit extra interest, since these are just separate lumps of grass and not in a landscape or anything. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on a couple of color variations for your grass. The one we've just been through is a very nice general color scheme, very easy to create and use quickly, and I often think it goes very well with pieces that are inspired by the Ghibli style, for an example. But sometimes you're going for something with a different aesthetic or maybe a bit less saturation in it. So here I'm just showing you 3 other options for slight variations of this. One cottagecore, one desaturated, and one a bit cooler. And for all variations, I've just mixed my previous 3 paint mixes with a bit of the corresponding color and then added a bit more white to the highlights. And I'm just showing you this footage very sped up. I'm going through the same process of these as earlier. And at the same time, you can see a couple of other compositions of this in the field from before. And when that's done, I will write out all the colors of the screen for you in case you want to have a look at them a bit more organized. When I do paintings in a more cottagecore style, I'll often mix in a bit of yellow ochre. It really just adds a very warm tone to this, and you can also push it further and create a more hay-like color palette this way. I thought I'd show one that could work as a shadow companion to the original palette, and shadows will most often be a cooler tone than their non-shadow version. So here I mixed in a bit of phthalo green to create this very cool version of the grass. And then for desaturating the palette, often you might think of adding gray for this, which is of course possible as well, but another way to desaturate your colors but still keep a bit more depth in it is by mixing in its complementary color. So here I add some red to it. Looking back at it, I could have added even more red, but I think it still shows how easily you can adjust the whole mood of the grass. So that was it for how to create these 3 different grass versions. I hope you did learn something from this. Obviously, I'm very new to making tutorials, so please let me know if you have any feedback for me in the comments, and I hope to see you next time.